Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a fantastic show for you this evening. Vic Syracuse is here with us to talk about buying and owning experimental amateur-built aircraft. Such a cool subject, and it is just a part of aviation that is growing exponentially. So I'm excited to start with that. Before we get started, a few quick notes. Tonight's broadcast will be recorded and available on SocialFlight's YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search on one word, SocialFlight. You'll be able to subscribe there. You get information about all of our upcoming broadcasts as they get recorded, and of course as well you get to see some progress on our own experimental amateur built aircraft, our Titan T-51D Mustang that we chronicle there on our YouTube channel with that. In addition, make sure that you check out SocialFlight.com and the free SocialFlight mobile apps for Apple and Android devices. SocialFlight is the free source for all information about like what's happening in general aviation. We want to be your mission. Where can you go fly? Where are the fly-ins, the pancake breakfast making a comeback with all the things that have gone on in general aviation in the past year to 2 years now. It's really amazing to be able to see that in-person events are coming back. And if you want to find a good place to get the $100 hamburger, find a destination, or go to an actual event, check it out on SocialFlight.com. Last thing is that if you do have the mobile app, you can also take part in our Fly to Win challenge. All you need to do, have the app, it'll check you in when you land at a new airport. You get points for that, and you are automatically entered in a drawing that we have regularly for all sorts of prizes. We have a custom pair of Flying Eyes eyewear that we are about to give away September 1st, which I believe is in only a couple days that we will be giving that prize away. So last check that you can get in on that, and then of course we'll have more giveaways after that. So with that, I would like to talk to you a little bit about Vic Syracuse. I am a huge fan, consider him a close friend, and Vic, he's an A&P and an IA. He's built 11 amateur-built aircraft, which I can't imagine doing in one lifetime. He's also a designated airworthiness representative for the FAA and has licensed hundreds of amateur-built aircraft, helping other people, and at the same time inspecting hundreds of those aircraft every year at his business, Base Leg Aviation at Falcon Field in Georgia. He has also written and published for both EAA as well as maintenance guides for amateur-built aircraft. Just a wonderful source of information, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here on the show tonight. So welcome, Vic, to the show. Let's bring him on now.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me here.
We need to get your camera on, Vic.
Is it off? Why did it go off? We'll try again. How's that?
There we go. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, so let's start with some basics here, because this is probably the most exciting part of aviation today is this experimental amateur-built world. But there's a lot of different ways of thinking of it. There's a lot of different segments to this. So take us through a little bit about what has evolved. Like, what are we really looking at now when someone uses that word experimental or amateur-built?
I think that's a great question, Jeff. If you think back to when Paul Pogoresny started EAA, Experimental Aircraft Association, it truly was experimental. I mean, there were a lot of plans-built airplanes. Majority of them were plans-built airplanes and designed one-offs. You know, if you think back, some of them made it to market, mainly as plans-built aircraft, but invariably they would all be different, right? And the FAA kind of carved out this piece of aviation called experimental aviation, really just to help with progress and nurture aviation along. You know, early on we had all the wars to help aviation. Actually, the wars really do help aviation progress. Then we had the air races. That was a lot of fun too, watching the airplanes progress through that. And then experimental aviation. And then, you know, late, maybe early 70s, early 80s, some of the, want to call them manufacturers out there, just realized there might be a market out there for more than one or two. And, completion rates when they were plans built weren't exactly real high. And, probably, very few of us knew anybody growing up. Now we're giving away our age, right? But we didn't know too many people building airplanes at home in their garages. And maybe once in a while you heard about one, and they always talked about the coot down the road doing something in the garage, right? But it was mostly kit cars back then that were being built. Then all of a sudden, right in late 70s, early 80s, some of the manufacturers started putting together kits. So some of the harder parts were made for you, especially some of the things that needed welding. Those aren't skills that everybody kind of knew. And we're going to use welding in an airplane, you kind of know what you're doing. And so, the Vans aircraft, the Glass Airs, and a few other manufacturers back then started putting things together, and whoa, the completion rates went way up. And all of a sudden people started seeing more of these and thinking, could I build one of those?
Yeah.
Pretty soon we had more people building them. I mean, it was kind of interesting when I first built my first airplane back in the early 80s, an RB4, no internet back then. So everything was word of mouth, telephone, but next thing you know, you're getting phone calls from people, not necessarily in the same town, but close enough that they could drive over same day. Hey, here you're building an RB4. And some of those people end up being friends for life, obviously. But all of a sudden, completion rates went up. People were trying to help each other. It got exciting. And, it's evolved to where it is today, where the kits are pretty much an assembly project. There's not a whole lot experimental about them. Granted, a lot of them, turn out different. But, we even have the ELSA and the SLSA carve out now. And those are pretty much standard. And the FAA's recognized the safety aspect of having them put together to the 51% stretch fit. And, it's a pretty good, it's grown into a huge market, not only now building airplanes, to a secondary market and a tertiary market and what I call non-builder owners. It's really the fastest growing segment of aviation out there.
Yeah.
People.
No, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah,
It seems to me like I remember like maybe in the late 90s or something like that when it really started to transition at shows like it was still Oshkosh back then, where the focus became build time now.
Yes.
It became, that was the brochure, right? That was as you went around and you saw these cool planes, what was the manufacturer going to promise you about build time, right?
Yes.
I guess in certified aircraft, it was always cruise speed or something like that. And this all became build time as it moved along. Now correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to me that we're at a point now where there is kind of maybe 3 segments out there that are not equal in proportion. There's still experimental, they're real experimental. There's still go to Oshkosh and see something you've never seen before that someone came up with or highly modified. And then you've got maybe another middle category of either aircraft that expect the builder to finish a whole lot of the stuff on their own or come up with solutions, or that are just highly modified. And then you have that huge segment you're talking about of what you were saying. They're basically builders are assemblers. Is that correct? Is that a good way of thinking of it?
I think it's dead on, Jeff. I think if you think about I call them the outliers, the experimental segment. I mean, even the space shuttle, SpaceX, et cetera, those are truly experimental aircraft, right? And they're licensed that way. And they're one-off or two-offs. There's still experimental aircraft being built, designed. Even some of the new ones that we've seen today at one time were experimental, a one-off. Somebody brought them to market, whether it was a Bearhawk or you can name any of them out there. It was originally the first one, and then the producer finds out if there's a market, and a few more get built out there, right? And that's kind of that secondary phase that you're talking about. But then all of a sudden, there's a market for pretty much a 51% kit.
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of the assembly ones we see today with the Carbon Cubs, the RVs, some of the Sonexes. They're not discouraging in a higher completion rate. If you think back to when it was truly experimental, I mean, the completion rates were probably around 15 to 20%. And you could pick up partially finished kits fairly cheaply on the used market and trade a plane especially. Not so much today. You pick up a partially completed kit on one of the better ones, and people are actually getting paid for their labor today. They're able to sell those kits for more than, you're not taking a beating on the kit as much as everybody used to.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think you define that very, very well.
So let's step back then and take a look at, you're dealing with people all the time who are these second owners, people who did not build the aircraft that they own. What type of person would you think is a really good candidate to look at this? If someone's thinking about buying an aircraft, we always like to think like, hey, that guy, that's a Cessna guy, that's a Bonanza guy, that's a whatever Mooney guy. We think about like people and what they appear to us. What type of qualities would have you in conversation say to someone, you should widen your search and you should really be thinking about maybe buying an experimental amateur build aircraft?
So I will tell you, it's a very, very broad spectrum. I take about 3 to 5 phone calls per day from people that are actually looking to buy an amateur build aircraft. The one I just had a couple hours ago is not unlike one I see maybe about every 2 a week. Is a student pilot. Somebody's not even a pilot. And
really
had a few lessons, and they've been at the airport, and they see, some of the more popular amateur built aircraft around. As an example, today it was an RV-12. Last week it was an RV because it was an RV-9. They hear from instructors, they hear from other people. You just, with the internet today, they sit down, can't fly all the time, so you're doing some Google searches. Great bang for the buck. Insurance for the more popular amateur built aircraft today is very much mainstream. It's insurance on them is kind of like a second car, so it's not killing you to learn to fly. And then we're seeing people from the higher end as well that are coming out of the Bonanza and the Cirrus market that are just they're getting a little bit beat up on cost of annual inspections, 15 to 20K a year. And on the certified market, as you're aware, and probably most of the audience, you have to take those to an A&P and IA every year to get those done. And, on the amateur built side, if you build the airplane, you actually become the repairman certificate, which is basically the A&P IA, so you get to sign that off every year. But for the non-builder owners that you're referring to, they still get to work on that airplane all year long. There's not a thing that they can't do. It's just at the end of that year, they have to have an A&P sign them off. So you're seeing people that are, one, mechanically inclined, sometimes just want to take on a project, buy airplanes, let's upgrade it, play with some of the new toys that are out there and put them in their cockpit. In the certified world, some of the toys we have in the amateur built world are behind.
Yeah.
They just can't do it for certification reasons, but you can do it in the amateur built world. So it's it's a broad spectrum, I guess, to put that wrap around it. From everybody's just interested in learning to fly. There's a segment that attracts them, and then the ones coming out of the higher end. There's airplanes out there that surpass what they're seeing today, both in performance, insurance costs, and what I call the fun factor.
Wow. So let's dive into that a little bit, because that's really fascinating. So on the first point that you made for flight training, I mean, it's always been a big topic of like the opportunity for people to buy a plane while they're going through their flight training. And usually you're thinking the classics, right? A Cherokee or a Cessna this or whatever. And do you find that it's this, I'll call it, what seems to me like an almost more recent evolution of like the sort of training type planes that have come out of like vans, like you mentioned, the 14 or 12 or something like that make it, that fill that gap? Or is it a lot of them that are a really good fit for training?
Yeah, it's more than a few. If you think about, so we've had the SLSAs for a while that are built by the factory, and then you have the ELSA, which is basically the same aircraft built at home. And I've been involved and seen a number of people that have both bought the SLSA buying it from the factory allows you to want to put on a leaseback program, get it for hire. There's some other opportunities that come with that. But some have just taken on, probably not unlike some of us or some of our audience here, childhood dream, can I build my own airplane?
Right.
And so you can do that. You can do that with the ELSA, build it, learn to fly it, and they're simple aircraft. They are basically training aircraft. There's a lot of flight schools out there today that have SLSAs in them, right on the flight line, and so they work.
Right.
And then
Right.
the RB9 is a good example of one that actually has higher performance, if you want to go a little bit faster, but it's still extremely docile. I told Van, I really think that airplane should have been certified. Obviously, there's a lot of requirements to go with that, et cetera. But it's a docile airplane that anybody can learn to fly in it. And I've also seen some people that have learned to fly in some of the higher performance airplanes too, the Carbon Cubs and the RV6s, 7s, 8s. 8s are a little difficult unless you get the fully dual control setup, so they make it a little difficult. But the side-by-side ones, I've seen a lot of people just go straight from building an airplane to learning to fly in it.
Yeah, and especially, of course, for our discussion here, we're talking about secondary purchases, but for those
Right.
people who are like thinking about buying, it would seem, of course, with the vans, any of the A's that you're talking, if you really want to stay with simplicity, you've got nose wheels on those, and then I think of things like even like the Zeniths, like 601s and things like that. They just seem, that one you've got the Y stick that each person can hold. They seem like great training aircraft, and why not consider buying in that?
Yeah, and you're dead on, and I actually was headed there. Then we are seeing people that are calling and going, hey, I want to learn to fly. Which airplane do you think would work for me? And they don't want to build. And actually beginning to hear more and more of that today. We live in a world where everybody's just extremely busy. But it's interesting with the pandemic, how many more completions we saw because people had time at home. But we're back to this fast-paced society that we live in, and a good majority of the people that I talk to on the pre-buy call, they don't have time to build, and they want to buy one. And there's probably, I would say, 10% of those are exactly the category you're talking about. I want to learn to fly. Okay, my buddy has this airplane, an RV or a Zen Air or something, and we have a lot of fun. I'm addicted. How do I get one? Can I learn to fly? We have a lot of conversations around that. But yes, they're easy to learn to fly. And now, truth be told, they're not as robust as the factory-built training aircraft. So you want to get somebody that understands the particular airplane that you're learning to fly in. Because as we all know, we've all had bad landings. We probably are all still going to have some bad landings left in our life, all right? And when we're learning to fly, some of those bad landings are memorable landings, right? And the amateur built aircraft just aren't quite as robust as factory training airplanes. So, you got to find somebody who's comfortable training you in an amateur built aircraft, because as we all know, there's a fine line as an instructor between destroying somebody's confidence and helping them build their confidence, right? So you want to get somebody there, and there are a lot of instructors out there that are doing that today. It's very easy to both get transition training, and as you're probably aware, the FAA's gone through this whole process here lately where you can get a load out fairly easy, so you can get training in your own airplane. It works, and it can be done, and it is being done.
So on that particular subject, before we move on, tell me a little bit. The FAA there's been a lot of talk recently about training in experimental aircraft. Can you explain to everyone what's going on and what we need to watch for here? Because that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and probably a very long conversation that we don't have time for here tonight. Basically,
we'll just touch on it because we want to get to the good stuff.
What prompted it all was basically somebody abusing the process, and it had to do with warbirds. All of us we all have a Walter Mitty inside of somewhere. We want to go fly that Mustang. You're going to get a chance to fly one, just hearing you here, but fly a real warbird, et cetera. And so, there was an operator, I believe in Florida that was actually doing that kind of thing under the guise of giving instruction. And the reality is, the regulations, you cannot carry a person or property for hire with experimental aircraft, all right? And without going into a lot of detail, rather than them working together and settling it, heads kind of butted, and so it ends up in court. And so now you're stuck with a ruling by people who maybe aren't as passionate as we are about aviation, and it got a broad paintbrush that said, well, we can't do that in experimental aircraft.
So what's the bottom line? So what's the bottom line for everybody out there now? If you go and when you advise someone, they're new to it, they want to learn, they go pick a plane. It could be a Vans, it could be a Zenith, it could be a Sonics, and whatever. But let's say mainstream aircraft, and they say, if I buy this, am I going to be able to get instruction in it?
So yes, two things. First off, to actually legally be able to get instruction, all you need is a letter from the FAA LODA, and it's all online now. Actually, somebody here locally got one in 15 minutes the other day. So all the hoopla, and I think they've put out close to 20,000 or something since this all came down. So the FAA actually streamlined that process, and they're working behind the scenes to undo it. Who knows what that'll happen? The reality is we have a Band-Aid right now. So yes, you can get that LODA. And then the next part of that is what I said a few minutes ago. You got to find an instructor. Okay. Now, there's certainly a lot of instructors out there that'll raise their hands because most of the instructors today see the airline job tomorrow. Okay. And quite candidly, you want somebody who's just not there to build time with you. Flying amateur built aircraft, they're a little different. Things happen faster. Some are overpowered, some are underpowered, et cetera. And again, back to you want just find somebody who's comfortable doing that. With all the EAA chapters out there at flight schools around today, we have a great flight school right here at the Falcon Field, and we've pointed a lot of people to them, transition training, where owners are actually taking the owners you're talking about, no different than learning to fly, are taking their airplanes and getting that transition training in their airplanes. So flight schools are doing that.
That's great. And you brought up a point I think is a really, really good point earlier about durability, which translates into also getting that instructor that really knows your plane. Because this seems to have been the fatal flaw of a lot of early or even LSAs, where they thought, well, we're going to populate all the flight schools, and pretty quickly the flight schools figured out, like, when these things hit the runway the same way a 150 hits the runway, they're not made for that. It's not happening, where our planes are getting bent where they weren't getting bent before. And even if you're buying one just for yourself, like you said, you don't want to do that to your own plane.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to be kind when I said that, but the converse of that is there's a great safety record on a lot of the mainstream amateur built aircraft, so much so that a number of years ago, and I was actually part of this program coming out, it's called the Additional Pilot Program. So for first flights in a lot of the mainstream aircraft, the FAA, with some requirements, was now allowing a qualified pilot in there for first flights with people who built their airplane. And so that, the FAA does recognize that there's some of these have a pretty good safety record already. So, and the one last comment I would say, for those who are thinking about learning to fly when you're buying your airplane at the same time, it's very easy to get, and this happens once in a while. I'll talk to somebody and they want to get what I call an outlier airplane because it looks cool and it tugs at their heartstrings since they were a little kid, et cetera. That might not be the wisest decision. It might make sense to get that one down the road, okay? But maybe find one mainstream first where there are some instructors that are near you and they're experienced in the aircraft, so you have a good experience learning to fly. Then go get that one that's your dream plane.
You don't want to start with the flying wing.
Right, exactly.
I always wanted a Dyke Delta.
Exactly.
I want that to be my training aircraft.
Yes. Yeah. I'll share a personal story. It's just recently this year, and some may be aware, is I decided after 10,000 hours of fixed wing, I wanted to learn how to fly a helicopter, and I thought maybe I ought to build a helicopter. I can make that 11 number 12. And to be honest, and even my wife kind of hit me in the head and said, maybe you ought to think about what helicopters are before you just go build one. And so it was the decision that I made was we've got a flying helicopter, and eventually I hope to build one, but it'll be a different decision. And I'm just saying you ought to go through the same thing when you're picking that airplane to learn to fly in.
That makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. Now, the second thing you also touched upon, which I think is really fascinating, is about the maintenance. And I think you brought something up that not a lot of people understand that I have spoken to about that maintenance. They do, I think most people understand you build the airplane, you're the manufacturer, you can do the inspection, etc. And if you buy one after the fact, you have to take it to an A&P for that condition inspection annually. There's a
Right.
middle thing, which you mentioned, that I'd love to hear more about, which is that although you have to take it there once a year, if you're mechanically inclined, there's a ton you're allowed to do. Those handcuffs of owning a certified aircraft and not being able to do anything unless an A&P signing everything off and observing it, those handcuffs are sort of off. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's actually the draw to a lot of people to owning now an amateur built aircraft. For those coming from the certified world, they know there's a list in FAR Part 43 of the things they're allowed to do, and it's very specific as an owner. Okay? Otherwise, it takes an A&P and then an IA for the annual. In the amateur built world, experimental aircraft, it's the exact opposite. The FAA, it's hands-off approach during the course of the year. You can do anything you want to that aircraft. Now, every amateur built aircraft also comes with a set of operating limitations. It's not a POH, it's operating limitations on FAA letterhead. And in there, it tells you the things you can and can't do, whether you can fly it on instruments, you can fly it at night, what your range is, et cetera, kind of thing. But one of those limitations states that if you make any major modifications, and that's defined in the FARs as well, then you need to call FSDO and they have you go back into phase one and do some testing. So what's a major modification? Think of anything that affects flight characteristics. So if you get your amateur build aircraft you just bought and you realize, well, your buddies have a constant speed propeller and you have a fixed pitch and you're not keeping up with them, or you want to do formation, you can't just necessarily put that constant speed on there without some guidance from the FAA as what you need to do. Okay, you can do it. You can do all that work yourself. You might just have to go back into phase one. Everything else that's not a major modification, you want to put a new instrument panel in there, you want to change the upholstery, you want to do the brakes, change the oil, spark plugs, anything you want to do on that airplane, and everything all year long, you can do it. It just takes on the annual, and we call them a condition inspection for amateur built experimental aircraft, either the holder of the repairman certificate, so if you bought it from your buddy who built it, and he or she has the repairman certificate and they're willing to sign it off, they can do that. Otherwise, it takes an A&P. Mm-hmm. An A&P can sign off that annual inspection. So yeah, maintenance costs go way down. And then, quite candidly, a lot of A&Ps out there, they don't necessarily understand your aircraft. And if you take the time to understand it, a lot of A&Ps will work with you to actually do the annual inspection. So, mm-hmm. Show them what all you've done, keep good logbook records, et cetera. And, a lot of owner-involved inspections happen around there, and it makes it a whole lot more fun. And you get to know your airplane a lot better too.
Right. And I think that's also there's a key distinction you made, and that is it's an A&P doing that.
It's not an IA. That's
not
correct.
Yeah, not an A&P with an inspection authorization, and that makes there's a lot more A&Ps out there in the world than there are IAs.
That's correct. Yep.
So let me just clarify so I understand. So if you purchase an aircraft and you do make a major modification, is the FAA getting involved in the evaluation of your modification? Do they come in and do an inspection again or anything like that? Or is it just about what testing you have to do?
It varies across, it's the FIS, so Flight Standards District Office, and I think there's around 13 of them around the country or more, and they all vary, okay? There's no requirement for them to come out. Sometimes they use it as an excuse to get out of the office, which I actually support,
Not anymore.
I'm trying to educate those guys. Yeah, since COVID, it's kind of changed. But sometimes they may want to come out and see what you've done. But they're not there to deny or whatever. It's because you already have an airworthiness certificate. It's usually just a matter of, okay, especially what happens when you buy, so let's talk about when you build the airplane, you get assigned a test area by the local FSDO. And so let's say you're in New York when you do that. Now somebody else buys this airplane there in California. and you do a major modification, requires a test area. So that's a conversation with the local FSDO, and they may issue new operating limitations to define a new test area for you to go do. Quite candidly, what I have found is if you call and explain them what you've done, most of the time the answer I get is, sounds like you know what you're doing, just go put it in phase 1 and test it. Okay, so they're actually pretty generous about it.
Can you define for everyone?
Go ahead.
Can you define for everyone what that phase 1 is, so they understand, since as an owner down the road they may have to do that? And also, I know this is an area that's evolved from being strictly hour-based to being more task-based.
Yes, great. Yeah, we need to clarify that. So when an amateur-built aircraft is built, it's required to go through what's called phase 1 flight testing. And there's 2 categories today. If you have a certified engine and propeller combination, you have to do 25-hour test program. Other than that, it's a 40-hour test program, right? And we've been working, I've been part of this task force as well with the FAA for a number of years now. You know, people have been flying in circles for 40 hours, and you don't really get a good tested aircraft. And we've worked with the AAA, we have this flight test manual that actually has a whole bunch of flight test cards that walk you through a whole flight test program. And we've demonstrated over the last few years to the FAA that you can actually get a much better product out the back end. And especially since everybody's realizing this non-builder owner market is so big, it'd be nice if, you know, we got, because with this flight test manual, as you call it, task-based, you get if you do it right, you actually get a POH out the back end. So it's really nice to be able to give that to a non-builder owner. And we're actually seeing a lot of new non-builder owners actually retest their aircraft, which is exciting. So the FAA has seen a lot of benefit to that, and we are this close. We were hoping to have it done at AirVenture. It's going to change here very soon now from hours-based phase 1 to task-based phase 1. And you know, the example is just for some clarification here. There's simple airplanes out there. You know, you can build a biplane with no electrical system. It doesn't take 40 hours to test that. A turbine Lancer 4 probably takes 50 or 60 hours. Okay, so but with task-based, you can actually whatever it takes, and you're done. Right? So once you have that done, phase 1 becomes complete, and then you make an entry in the logbook that you completed phase 1 testing. What that means is now you can treat this aircraft pretty much like you treated your certified aircraft. If in the way the operating limitations read, the current order is if you equip it appropriately with the instruments required in 91-205, I think it is, you can fly on instruments. If you have the strobes and position lights, you can fly at night. There are some requirements to go out of our country. You got to use 12-inch end numbers, and we have to have a bilateral agreement. Like going to Canada and the Bahamas is no problem, but each country's a little different on experimental aircraft. Other than that, you can take off and fly all the way across the country, just like you could in your Cirrus.
That's awesome.
So that's awesome. Phase 2, and you're always in phase 2 until you make any major modifications. Then you may have to go back into phase 1. Phase 1 is typically when you go back into it 5 hours or less. Okay,
makes sense.
For those of you thinking about buying an aircraft from Canada or another country, we typically don't make them go through a 40-hour test program again if there's some proof in the logbooks that they went through the flight test program. So you want to make certain of that there's documentation of that. I have a couple of customers who have yard ornaments because they're back to, oh, I'm so excited about that airplane, flew it down here, and there's no documentation. Nobody's willing to certify it because one of the other requirements is that you have to prove that it was built by an amateur. It's called amateur built for a reason, right? So if it comes from another country, and there are countries out there that are allowed to produce these aircraft, Brazil is one, South Africa, they can produce them commercially. You can't buy one here and bring it and try and license it as amateur built. So you want to be careful with those. I have to talk to a number of people about those.
Now, when someone is looking to buy one of these aircraft, you bring up an interesting point, because the first thing, other than selecting, you know, what you want to fly, of course, is how you start the process of evaluating what aircraft you even meet your quality standards or meet anything like that. And the first level seems to be almost like getting a name brand engine overhaul or something that there's a lot floating out there of, well, this is a so-and-so assembled kit. Where's that gray area of what's really amateur built with some of these that have been, let's say, a building that has produced a surprising number of one given model or another?
Yeah, so we do have some of what we call pro building going on out there, and the FAA is kind of looking the other way. For the most part, we're getting a safe product out of it, and in the new order that they're working on for new aircraft certification, I believe there's going to be an allowance in the future for pro building to be legal, but it's not today. Okay, so you want to be careful with that. Basically, what I tell everybody, and this is, I know you mentioned, I have written a couple of books, and one of them's on pre-buys. It is the book out there on pre-buys for amateur built aircraft. It's being used a lot. And I help everybody through those, one, understanding what it is, fits your mission requirements, maybe your pocketbook requirements, and then go help to look at an aircraft. What I tell everybody at the end of the day is, we can fix most everything on the aircraft, right? We resurrected Glacier Girl from under the ice, but you want to make certain that you have the capabilities to do that. And it starts with the airframe structure. You want to make certain the airframe structure is built correctly and right. After that, everything's really replaceable. The engine's replaceable. That didn't come as part of the kit. The avionics didn't come as part of the kit. The paint didn't come as part of the kit. So we really want to start with that airframe and make certain it's right. And that's where it helps to go mainstream, find out who built it, find a good pre-buy inspector, use my book, okay? And the rest of the stuff is fixable. Now, it takes money too to fix that. So you want to understand what your budget is, understand how the airplane's been maintained. It's interesting, a little bit ago, you bring up the maintenance side. One of the pet peeves I have is way back early when Paul Pogoresny started all this, it made sense for the FAA to say, well, you built the Starduster, it's a fabric airplane, no electrical system. Yeah, you probably know more about it than any A&P out there, so we're gonna allow you to become the A&PIA. Today, with the kits that we're seeing, whether it's Carbon Cub or RV10s or RV14s with 6-cylinder Lycomings, full glass panels, look at the Lancer 4Ps that are turbines flying up in the flight levels, full autopilots, etc. No training, and yet you get issued the repairman certificate. So the questions you really want to delve into is, how's the aircraft been maintained? Who maintained it? Where did you learn to maintain it? What we see a lot of is, especially an aircraft that's gone through maybe 2 owners since the original build, so we're on the 3rd owner. So remember, as we talked a little bit ago, the 2nd owner had to go get an A&P involved all the time for the condition inspection. And most of them don't really understand the maintenance, so they have somebody else doing that. One of the, on IA, when they sign off a certified airplane, they have to go look up ADs and service bulletins, right? There's no requirement for that in the amateur built world. Most A&Ps don't even know where to go look. Now, the better mainstream manufacturers out there in the amateur built world do put service bulletins out there quite regularly. And some of those service bulletins are very close to being, there would be an AD in the certified world. We don't issue ADs against amateur built aircraft. The regulations don't allow for that. But when you see a service bulletin that says prior to further flight, that's probably an AD. So some of the questions you want to ask and get the logbooks is to understand, have the service bulletins been complied with? If not, why not? Okay, and who's been doing the maintenance? Has the airplane sat? What kind of oils? Is it on an oil analysis program? So there are things you do want to ask to understand what monies you might have to outlay. And quite candidly, going to find an airplane across the country these days is expensive. So you want to find out as much as you can over the telephone and get as much information before you spend real dollars to go out there and look at it.
Right. Now that's a really, really interesting point that you made about that. We always think of aircraft in terms of like low time and how was it built, et cetera. But if you're starting, as you mentioned, from a point of assembly, this is a known entity, this is a kit that the manufacturer has done as much as possible to simplify. That's a very, very interesting point, that the person who has completed that and it may even be that they bought even firewall forward complete, right? That person has done all of this and is now licensed to be the only maintainer and only inspector of that plane over, let's say, 5 or 10 years of ownership. That's a really interesting concept, because myself as an A&P and IA, right, there's years of experience and training and everything else, and AC 4313 and all of these things that go into how do you do a structural repair when something whips? How do you maintain these engines? How do you inspect them? How do you know all this? And so in theory, you could have an aircraft that was built exactly the way it was supposed to be built, but the wear and the life of that aircraft were not necessarily addressed by someone with any training to do so.
You know, you're dead on. And what I know you mentioned, we have a business space like aviation, a very much a growing segment of our business today are those people who build airplanes and are now coming to the realization 9, 10 years down the road, it's time to have somebody look at that aircraft besides themselves. And we are amazed at what we see. We give them a big round of applause for doing that. I have my son look at my airplane, because sometimes we can look at things and miss, right? But it's amazing some of the 9 and 10-year-old aircraft that we're seeing coming through the door, and they're borderline unairworthy.
Wow.
And you know, we have the conversation with them, and they point blank say, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
We know. So it's good that it's being recognized, but we're seeing real evidence of what you just brought up, Jeff, is that without the training, and you talk about buying firewall forward, a lot of these kits anymore, the engine and the firewall forward is all match drilled, hoses are built, you just follow the instructions, and you know, back 30 years ago, people needed to understand, and we had to go source the proper governor, understand gear ratios if it was a constant speed propeller, and induction systems, but nobody has to understand that today. It's an assembly project, okay? Right. And as a DAR, it's mind-boggling. Some of the service bulletins that Vans has issued, I've been responsible for by finding problems as a DAR. People leaving plastic caps on injection lines because the instructions didn't say, take that off, okay? Wow. So, you know, it's the skills even for building today, the inquisitiveness is not as much there. And it's not the fault, it's where we are. It's, right. Wow, I can build an airplane. So it's an IKEA project, okay? In their instructions, they don't come with blueprints anymore.
Right. So it may even be, it occurs to me, it may even be advantageous if you are the second owner, if you're not the builder of an aircraft that you own, and you're going to do that condition inspection, it may even make sense, like, to enlist an IA who's experienced in that to come in, even if it's not even beyond an A&P, because of not just that inspection, but because there's so many parts, at least firewall forward on these aircraft, but also wheels, brakes, things like that in many cases, that even if you don't have to comply regulatorily or something like that, wouldn't it be great to have someone who really knows, hey, you can call this engine whatever you want, but I know that it's basically a Lycoming 0360, and I know what happens on those. I see them through my shop all the time. I'm going to look up all the ADs, all the SBs. I'm going to go through this thing for you because that's my job. That's what I do.
That's great. And the counsel that I give non-builder owners is exactly what you just said, Jeff. It's what warms the cockles of my heart, okay? And because what happens is that some of them take their airplanes home to an airport, and the local AMPs don't want anything to do with it because they don't know the RV, blah, blah, blah. And so you have to load them up with, you don't know the RV. I'm going to get help on the RV, on the airframe portion of it. But you know what? It is a Lycoming engine. It's a hard cell propeller. The whole fleet of aircraft that you're working on out here are exactly the same. And I would just like your eyes and ears for the things that you just mentioned. What are the service bulletins, the ADs, the things I need to look at? What's this intake gasket people are talking about needing replacing? Point me to those kind of thing. And you'd be surprised at A&P, then all of a sudden, oh yeah, I do understand that. Oh yeah, if the cowling comes off, yeah, that's what I work on every day. Let me help you out. Okay, so yes, it's just, you need to do that. Okay, and quite candidly, the more we can do to get A&Ps out there more comfortable with this largest growing segment of aviation, we all win. They win, It's good business for them because it's growing, and it shouldn't make them nervous. Okay, because the mainstream aircraft that we're seeing out there in this growing segment, the manufacturers themselves do a great job with the service bulletins. So the A&Ps are used to going out and looking at the certified places for service bulletins for help. You just got to point them to a different place. Okay?
Right.
It's not even subscription like in the certified world. Just you go to the website, download the stuff, etc. So, and there's so many forums out there, for a lot of the mainstream ones. You can get almost all the information they need to feel comfortable. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, there's so many things that come to mind that we can learn and that owners can learn from certified mechanics. That just I don't care what you've built. If it's got an exhaust system, that guy knows how to inspect it for leaks. That guy knows what tends to go, how joints work on any. It doesn't matter. Like there's so many things like that we can learn if we can get those folks involved. It seems to make an awful lot of sense.
absolutely.
The other area that comes to mind about how to teach or what your thoughts are on that is, as you mentioned, since these secondary owners can make changes and can do things like that, there's some benefit to learning about standard practices for that, to understanding the difference between a bolt that you got at Home Depot versus a bolt that you might get from an aircraft supplier that has pedigree. Like, depending on what you're trying to do with it, it might matter. Like, what are your thoughts in that area about how people can educate themselves, or what you tell owners who now are excited and want to roll up their sleeves and start making changes?
Yeah, so don't go to the hardware store. It's funny, I actually, as a DAR, went to license an airplane last summer that had all hardware store bolts in it. And it's, well, oh my God, I couldn't believe it, a fully aerobatic airplane. So no airworthiness certificate there. Okay, but yes, and I think you already mentioned AC 4313. I had a copy. I loaned it to my granddaughter, who's an aspiring A&P. I was actually going to show that tonight because, yes, it is the Bible out there. If you're curious about anything or what's a good way to repair it, get that book. The other thing I will tell you is, luckily, we have this thing called the internet today. Now, there's also a lot of bad information out there. So don't put something out there and ask for a bunch of opinions. Go to good, reliable sources. The EAA is a bunch of libraries on the EAA website. Videos will teach you all the kinds of repairs on your particular aircraft, what's going on, some of the forums, and there are recognized authority people out there. The factory or the kit provider, it's amazing. They, unlike some of the rest of the world where, oh, you're the second owner, we don't have anything to do with you. It's not that way in amateur-built aviation. Everybody's willing to help you. Pick up the phone. Vans is one example. They'll answer the phone whether you're the third, fourth owner, and answer your question whether you bought the kit yesterday. It's just the way it is. So, take advantage of that. And there's a good program. The EAA has these things called technical counselors all over the country. You can go on the website and find a tech counselor that's close to you. And there are requirements to be a tech counselor, and you can find them specific to your aircraft. If you can't find one locally, we have this thing called FaceTime. I do a lot of that with people. They'll just, hey, I found this on my airplane. What do you think, or what should we do? And a picture's worth 1,000 words. It works all the time. So don't think you got to do this yourself. Those are some of the worst airplanes we see are somebody who and I don't get it in today's environment of just ask. Okay,
Yeah.
Just ask. There's a lot of help out there. There's a lot of great help out there today.
I totally agree. And as I brought up with the bolt example there, I mean, one of my personal pet peeves in that area is people understanding and respecting the quality of components designed for certified aircraft. Now, I don't mean parts you buy from an OEM and a manufacturer, but I do mean the things like, what's the difference between getting wiring that is, aircraft quality mil-spec wiring versus, something nothing about that you just grabbed off of eBay, or, crimp connectors or anything like that. Those are just some examples, but all these types of things. You can buy a lot of stuff made for cars and boats and whatever really, really cheap and just say yourself, oh my God, why would anyone buy all this stuff from, from an aircraft company? Uh, it's not the same quality.
No, it's not. But the converse of that is we all kind of joke once in a while, oh yeah, I went to the aviation aisle at Home Depot or O'Reilly's or Gap or something. There are good parts there. I would call them non-structural parts. You don't want to be using hardware bolts from Home Depot, et cetera, for your wing, main spar bolts, et cetera. But sometimes, some of the fittings, as you mentioned, on the wiring, automotive wiring, when it burns, it gives off pretty noxious fumes. You don't want that stuff in your cockpit. Plus, it's stranded a little bit differently. It won't hold up well in vibrations. Matter of fact, I worked on an RV-10 one time. They wanted a panel upgrade, and we pulled out part of the panel, and inside this RV-10 was wired with all Romex house wiring. No, you can't do that. Right? That's why
What was that panel looking like over there? That when he flips the household circuit breakers on and off.
Yeah. Oh, there were actually real house circuit breakers in there as well. It was.
Oh my God, I was joking. Wow.
Yeah. It's experimental aviation, right? I guess you can do it. You can do it. But for those who are looking to buy one, that's why you want to look underneath the covers and make certain, you understand what you're getting into. Unfortunately, some people, what you want to be careful of is and some people are tinkerers and they want a project and they know that's what they're going to get and they're going to work on it. That's okay. But if you're going to get an airplane that you think is going to be as reliable as your Cirrus or your 172, take the family on vacations, or you want to go do things, you want to you want to look under the covers really, really well. So it is going to be reliable, and they are out there. Okay, probably a good 80 to 90% of the aircraft on the market out there will meet those needs. The other ones are probably still experimental at times.
Right. That makes sense. So I think one of the great messages out of that is you mentioned technical advisors at EAA, and I think a lot of times people think about that for building an aircraft, and maybe that's actually your one of your go-to resources. You need your kind of board of directors as an owner of an aircraft in your world, and maybe one of those people is going to be the A&P or IA that's going to help you when, as the years go by. Maybe another one of those might be a technical counselor or someone, so that when you want to change something, they can kind of say, that's, you can go shop at the aviation aisle in your local big box store, because you're just talking about, ergonomics, or you're talking about something that doesn't have huge impacts, or hey, you're talking about a really key core system and you need to buy quality components for that wherever you get them.
That's great. It's interesting, probably not unlike people buying cars. As soon as they get it, they got to kind of personalize it, I call it. We see the same thing with aircraft. A non-builder owner is they want to personalize it. Oh, let's go put air conditioning in it. Let's go do this modification. So-and-so told me this is good, without any consideration to, oh, what's the weight and balance? How does it affect performance? Was it ever designed for that engine, that propeller, et cetera? So great advice there, Jeff. Caution, go ask. Ask people who are familiar. The type forms are a great source for that knowledge. Hey, will this work? I'm thinking about doing this. Because the last thing you want is, make a Frankenstein out of your airplane.
So take me through here as we near the end of the hour. Someone goes, you advise them. I mean, this is what you do at Base Leg Aviation. You advise them, help them guide to what might work for them, and then what? What's a pre-purchase inspection like on an experimental amateur built aircraft? What happens when you get your hands on one of these?
So before I actually put my hands on it, we review logbooks. We actually walk away from probably 20 to 30% of the aircraft just by reviewing the logbooks. Back to what I was telling you, we learn all about maintenance. We can see if an aircraft has sat, for any length of time during its history, which is just, and it may not be that we walk away from it, but now the potential new owner realizes, I might have an engine problem there. Lycomings, which are the more common engines used in the mainstream amateur built aircraft, they do not like to sit. Lycoming engines, if they sit for any length of time, the camshaft just takes a beating. And so you'll see some out there. And unfortunately, a lot of them are estate kind of things where somebody died, and it's kind of hard to part with that from a family standpoint. So it sits for a couple of years, or people lose their medical, or they lose interest in their aircraft. And they sit for 4 or 5. We had one that sat for 7 years here a while back. You just plan on an engine teardown. So, and then we want to make certain, I see a lot of aircraft, people forget that phase 1 sign off. Remember I mentioned that a little bit ago? You get through phase 1, you have to make an entry in the logbook that you've completed phase 1 before you can leave your test area or carry passengers. I've caught a number of aircraft. The worst one was, I think, 8 years old, been through 3 owners, phase 1 had never been signed off. So the aircraft was illegal all this time. And I still run across that probably, I bet once every 2 months, somebody's not signed off phase 1, or the operating limitations are missing. So the paperwork is very much a large part of that. We try and get through all that stuff before we physically go see the aircraft. And then we have 2 choices. You can come to my shop for an inspection, or I go to your place to do the inspection wherever the aircraft is. And basically, it's as much as we can do. It's being a DAR, it's pretty much an airworthiness inspection. I go into a lot of detail on the engine, including bore scoping it, compression checks, check timing. We'll plot all the spark plugs. You can tell an awful lot the condition of the engine, short of pulling a cylinder, which I won't do on a pre-buy unless it's in our shop, to take a look at the camshaft. And then pull all the inspection panels on the aircraft. For the most part, the only ones that are really somewhat challenging are the fiberglass airplanes. Unless somebody kept records of how many layups were done, how they were done, it's really kind of hard to tell. For most of the metal tube and fabric airplanes, there are enough inspection panels that you can get in there and see the construction, check for corrosion, wear items, see that service bulletins were done with, etc. And then you look at all the maintenance items on the aircraft: brakes, wheels, tires. To be candid, one of the first things I look at is when I'm walking in the door is I look at the condition of the hangar. It's a very good sign into what the condition of that airplane is going to be like.
Interesting.
Walked into some hangars that probably could have used some FEMA help.
So message to folks looking to sell your aircraft: clean up your hangar before Vic arrives.
Yeah, and clean the airplane. I'm amazed at how many people, and I get it, maybe they just have lost interest in the airplane, that's why they're selling it. But I show up and some airplanes are just absolutely filthy, horrible. It's like, you're trying to sell this, at least clean it up or pay somebody to clean it up. First impressions just make a big difference with everybody.
How much do you care about, and let's assume that you do have access for inspection, how much do you care about the builder log? That's usually used just to prove to the FAA you're the builder, that you did the work. Is that important to you?
So it's not as much important to me as it is to help somebody understand buying it. They do want the build records in case they go to sell that aircraft down the road and maybe it leaves the country and somebody will have to prove that it was amateur built. Certainly in the case of fiberglass airplanes, and even in some of the tube and fabric metal airplanes, the build records, especially with pictures, can help you understand and see the places that maybe aren't nearly as visible, on a pre-buy inspection. So they do help, and somebody has all the documentation. That aircraft is worth more than one that doesn't. It's just unknown. So good logbooks, maintenance history, good builder logs, all that stuff just increases the value of the aircraft.
Got it. Excellent. Well, Vic, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time this evening. We could talk forever on this subject, and I've done my best to fit some questions in that people have, but there's a lot of questions out there. How do people reach you and Base Leg Aviation?
So Base Leg Aviation is a website, www.baselegaviation.com. We have our email addresses there, phone numbers if you have specific questions. Hopefully we didn't turn any of you off on this growing segment of aviation, because it really is exciting. And quite candidly, our best friends in life have been met through amateur built aviation, and it's just a much different camaraderie. So for those of you who are even thinking about dipping your toe in it, go ahead. Okay, it is a lot of fun, but that's the easiest way to get a hold of us.
Excellent. And so I'd recommend to anyone out there, if you did not get, if I wasn't able to incorporate your question into our discussion this evening, we weren't able to take direct questions during the program here at Social Flight Live, feel free to reach out to Vic Syracuse at Base Leg Aviation. Check out his website, check out what he's got to offer, and above all else, of course, read his articles in EAA, Sport Aviation, and also the books that he's written. Great resources for anyone who is considering anything in this market, which I think is got to be the most exciting market in aviation today. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Vic, for giving us your time this evening.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to everyone else, thank you for giving us your time in joining Social Flight Live. We will be back next week, September 7th, with Brian Schiff talking about the possible turn. Brian's going to talk all about the things that there've been so much discussion recently on the quote impossible turn and ways to deal with that, as well as many other subjects that could help you with your flying, especially if you face an emergency in the future. On Tuesday, September 14th, Pete Bunce of Gamma, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, will be joining us here on the show. And on the 21st, Captain Gary Dyson of Orbis, the flying hospital that we put a video out there on YouTube on Social Flight's channel. Amazing place where eye surgery is done on an MD-10 aircraft. Just amazing. You have to watch that and join us for the show. So with that, again, thank you, Vic, so much for your time this evening. And I'd like to wish all of you for joining us this evening blue skies. Good night, everybody.